Hey, good morning. You're watching Fair World Order. My name is Jeff, and this is take two on trying to get this show off the ground. So the show is called Fair World Order. Just want to take a minute to a quick minute, just kind of talk about what I'm doing with this show. So this is going to be a news-based show and also opinion, and my analysis of the news rooted in a system of values, which I'll be talking more about on Friday, and not just reciting the news, not just giving an opinion on the news, but really talking about centering the news in actions we could take to make a better tomorrow. And so today is Wednesday, January 20th, 2021. I'm not going to do the full show. I'm not going to do the full show today. This is kind of a dry run for me, but I am going to take some time to talk about the upcoming inauguration. Tomorrow, I'll be talking about the outgoing administration, and then on Friday, I'm going to take some time to talk about really what those values that I mentioned are, what I want to do with this show, and then on Monday, hopefully we'll be running right into the full show, and I'll be talking about world news. I'll be talking about local news, but not necessarily my local news, but stories throughout different parts of the country that maybe deserve some attention. I'm going to talk about some things such as the Innocence Project, which works on freeing wrongly incarcerated individuals. I'm going to be talking about some GoFundMe campaigns that aren't getting a lot of attention, but are worthy of some charity. I'm going to be talking about some news stories from some perspectives that are not necessarily a white male straight American perspective. So I'm going to be coming through some alternative news sources, some news stories that are just being blacklisted by the mainstream news. And then throughout all of this, I'm going to be looking at these stories from my particular value system and talking about what I think, what the relevance of these stories are to how we conduct ourselves and how we live our lives. But first, like I said, this is the inauguration after 4 years of Donald Trump. He has just a few hours left in office right now. And of course, Joseph Biden will be coming in as the president, the 46th president, with Kamala Harris as the vice president. So without getting too much into my own personal story, I am in the military, although nothing I say here everything I say here reflects my views. Nothing reflects the views of the government or the military. But because I'm in the military, there are some things that I am restricted in what I can say about public officials. So since today, Joseph Biden is still the president-elect, as at the time of this broadcast, and not the actual president, this is the last time for now where I can kind of speak freely about Joseph Biden. And then, of course, tomorrow, I'll be able to really speak freely after 4 years of not being able to do so about Donald Trump and his administration. But talking about Joseph Biden and really talking about why I was so opposed to Joseph Biden being the Democratic nominee. Once he became the nominee, it was kind of a no-brainer that he would be better than Trump, and it's not even close. But I do want to talk about why I was so opposed to him being the nominee in the first place. And it really has to do with understanding his particular history. So, let's see. All right. So this is Joseph Biden. And here he is with a gentleman named Strom Thurmond. And to really understand the objection to Joseph Biden, we kind of have to go back in history and talk about Strom Thurmond. Now, I'm 44 years old. I think most people around my age, give or take a decade, have heard of Strom Thurmond, but don't really have the proper context for understanding just how bad of an individual he was. So for me growing up, I heard the name Strom Thurmond, the senator from South Carolina, and it was always the old man in the Senate. He would usually be referred to as a segregationist, but that's kind of where it ended. Every once in a while, somebody would refer to him as being racist, but not having lived through his heyday, which I did not, I didn't really have the proper context for what his history was, what his legacy actually was. So I want to talk a little bit about Strom Thurmond. So in 1925, at the age of 22, he fathered a black daughter with a employee of his family at the time, a servant of his family at the time, and she was 16 years old. Strom Thurmond never publicly acknowledged this daughter. His estate finally acknowledged his daughter after he passed away. Although he did financially support her throughout his life and did help get her through college, he never publicly acknowledged her, and he spent his entire life ensuring that her rights as a black woman were violated by the U.S. government. And I will back up that statement here in a moment. So in 1948, and at the time I believe he was the governor of South Carolina, but he ran for president on the Dixiecrat ticket. So the Dixiecrats, if you go back to the 1940s and earlier, the Democrats were the primary party of the South. You know, think back to Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. The Democrats were the primary party of the Southern secessionists. They were the party of slavery. They were the party of the Ku Klux Klan. This really started to change in the 1920s and 30s. And by the 1940s, when Harry Truman ordered the desegregation of the military, it really broke with it. Really began the break of the Democrat Party, of the racists switching from the Democrats to the Republicans, and it started with the Dixiecrats, which was a group of Southern Democratic lawmakers and politicians who broke away from the Democratic Party, formed their own party in opposition to Harry Truman's desegregation of the military, and Harry Truman was their candidate for president in 1948. So even though Strom Thurmond was himself a decorated war veteran, he was so opposed to blacks being treated equally in the military that he left his party, formed a new party, and ran for president to reverse that decision. He failed to win he failed on the presidency, obviously. The Dixie Democrats went away, and then he went back to being just a regular Democrat. In 1956, he personally did the longest in-person filibuster in the Senate history. At this time, he was now a senator from South Carolina, and he spoke nonstop for 24 hours, 18 minutes, for the purpose of preventing a vote on the initial Civil Rights Act. He was so opposed to blacks having rights codified in law that he spoke nonstop for 24 hours and 18 minutes. At that time, in order to do a filibuster, you had to actually hold the floor uninterrupted. Now it's more of a procedural vote issue, but back then you actually had to do it. Strom Thurmond had the longest filibuster in the Senate's history. Again, in opposition to civil rights. Also in 1956, in response to the Civil Rights Act and the desegregation of the military, he wrote the first draft of what would be called the Southern Manifesto. And in this draft, these are his words, or the words of the manifesto which he helped write. And this is actually specifically in response to the Brown v. Board of Education, which was decided just previous to this. This unwarranted exercise of power by the court, contrary to the Constitution, is creating chaos and confusion in the states principally affected. It is destroying the amicable relations between the white and Negro races that have been created through 90 years of patient effort by the good people of both races. It has planted hatred and suspicion where there has been heretofore friendship and understanding. Now, what I have right underneath this, is to help contextualize just how egregious this statement is. It's not an exact one-to-one. 1882 to 1968 isn't the exact 90-year period he was referencing, but it's within 10 years of that, or 12 years of that. And during that time, 3,446 black people were lynched. So in the time that Strom Thurmond is describing as good relations between blacks and Negroes, almost 3,500 of those blacks were in fact lynched by white people. So his concept of good relations tolerates and in fact welcomes the lynching of black people. That's who Strom Thurmond was. In 1964, after Lyndon Johnson pushed for the passage of the Second Civil Rights Act, and also around the time that the Voting Rights Act was being voted on, Strom Thurmond left the Democratic Party for good and joined the Republican Party. He supported Barry Goldwater, the Republican nominee for president in 1964, and then Richard Nixon in 1968. And one could argue, even though the Southern strategy, which was an attempt to appeal to Southern racist Democrats by the Republican Party, One could, generally that's associated with Richard Nixon and Lee Atwater, but one could argue that Strom Thurmond was the de facto leader of that movement. If it wasn't for Strom Thurmond leaving the Democrat Party, this strategy would not have been successful. Strom Thurmond was the leader of the Southern Democrats. His leaving was what made the Southern strategy successful. Not so much in 1964, but definitely in 1968 with the election of President Nixon. So this is who Strom Thurmond was. He was not just a segregationist. He was not just a racist. He was, for the better part of 30 years, the nation's leading segregationist and racist. He was the pillar of white supremacy in this country and the institutional power of whites and the suppression, oppression of blacks within the United States. And this is the person that in 1973, Joe Biden reached out to and befriended. So in 1972, Joe Biden won election to the Senate from Delaware. He was sworn in 1973, and almost immediately he befriended Strom Thurmond. So this isn't the case of, I didn't know who Strom Thurmond was. He knew who Strom Thurmond was. Strom Thurmond was one of the most famous politicians at the time. It was well known where he stood on these issues. And in 1973, he was just a few years removed from leading a wave of Democrats out of the party, specifically because of racism. And Joe Biden saw this and said, this is the person I want to work with. And more importantly, Strom Thurmond saw in Joe Biden somebody that he would work with. And if you're listening to this, I just want you to try to put yourself in the mindset, as grotesque as it is, but put yourself in the mindset of Strom Thurmond, somebody who had spent his entire life, left his party twice, spent his entire life in opposition to desegregation, in opposition to civil rights, in opposition to equality for blacks. And then he sees somebody, in this case Joe Biden, and says, this is my kind of guy. What does that tell you about Joe Biden in 1973? And here's some statements from Joe Biden about Strom Thurmond, because Strom Thurmond believes deeply in what he does, and at every point of view, has to have its day in court, its day in the Senate. Well, no, Joe Biden, Strom Thurmond didn't actually believe that. He actually spent most of his life ensuring that an entire class, an entire race of people don't get their day in court, don't get their day in the Senate, don't have their point of view heard. In the 1970s, Joe Biden was basically himself opposed to desegregation. He opposed and this came out, and this became a prominent feature in one of the initial Democratic debates in 2000. But he opposed the busing of blacks to white schools in Delaware, and in multiple votes, he opposed acts of desegregation in the country, and particularly in Delaware. In the 1980s, now for me, growing up in the 80s, I associated the war on drugs primarily with Ronald Reagan, Nancy Reagan's program of DARE, Dare to Say No to Drugs, the crack cocaine epidemic. I always associated the war on drugs with Republicans. In hindsight, and now being able to go back and look at history, the truth is, Ronald Reagan actually initially opposed escalating the war on drugs. He vetoed the Biden-Thurmond bill, which would have created a drug czar, because Ronald Reagan was actually a committed small government politician. He did not want to expand the federal budget. He didn't want to expand the federal government. So he vetoed this bill. From 1981 to 1995, Joe Biden was on the Senate Judiciary Committee either as chairman or as ranking member of the minority party. And he, excuse me, and he reached across the aisle with Strom Thurmond to create legislation, tough on crime legislation. He, speaking to his fellow Democrats, he actually replaced Ted Kennedy on the Senate Judiciary Committee, at least as the ranking member on the Senate Judiciary Committee. And he basically told his fellow Democrats, leave crime to me and we'll never have to worry about it again. He saw that the Republicans' tough on crime stances were garnering them votes throughout the country. He wanted to make that a Democrat issue. So he took over being the voice of tough on crime within the Democratic Party. And again, reached out to his good friend Strom Thurmond to create these policies, to help create policies. So the 1982 Biden-Thurmond bill was vetoed by Ronald Reagan. However, the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984 did get voted into law and signed by Ronald Reagan, as did the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, and then the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994. These bills, these three bills in particular, what they did was they created a drug czar. They created disproportionate penalties for, say, crack cocaine or crack or regular cocaine, powder cocaine. They established federal mandatory minimum sentences, and they allowed for the federal funding of local law enforcement. So these three acts, when we look at modern policing from a federal perspective, these were the three laws that created the modern prison industrial complex, the modern militarized police state, and the wave of black male incarceration throughout the country. This was Joe Biden's legacy. He was probably the most important person in creating these wave of laws, which have devastated black communities and militarized our police force throughout the country. If local law enforcement relied on their own funding, they would not be able to militarize to the degree that they have now. That is allowed by federal funding. All right, so that was the one on drugs. Let's talk about Anita Hill for a minute. Again, this is Joe Biden's legacy. So Joe Biden was, as I previously mentioned, the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, responsible for confirming Supreme Court justices. During the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearing, Anita Hill came forward with allegations of sexual harassment against Clarence Thomas. Joe Biden had all the power in the world to actually do something about this, to prevent Clarence Thomas from being on the Supreme Court, and to give women their voice in dealing with what up to that point was not talked about on a national level, and that's workplace sexual harassment. Instead of giving a fair hearing, he allowed Clarence Thomas to testify twice, both before and after Anita Hill. He refused to call any supporting witnesses, even though there were at least 3 people that were willing to come forward and substantiate Anita Hill's testimony. He allowed disparaging questions from the Republican members of the committee. And after almost 30 years, he never actually apologized to Anita Hill. At the start of his 2019-2020 presidential campaign, he did reach out and call Anita Hill. However, in interviews following that phone call, she was adamant that nothing he said constituted an actual apology. He would use words like, it's unfortunate what happened to you, but he never apologized for his conduct during that hearing. Joe Biden had the opportunity to meaningfully address sexual harassment, and instead he chose to put unopposed Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court. All right, LGBTQ rights. In 1993, he voted for Don't Ask, Don't Tell. In 1996, he voted for the Defense of Marriage Act. In 2004, he stated that marriage was between a man and a woman. In 2008, he spoke out against rights for gays. And finally, in 2012, he came out in favor of marriage equality and was, in all fairness to Biden, he was instrumental in pushing Obama to adopting that position. By this point, I believe Joe Biden was 63 years old. So he had spent most of his public career opposing equal rights for gays and lesbians. Voted on significant legislation that restricted the rights of gays and lesbians, and not until it was politically expedient and pretty much widely accepted in the country that these laws were immoral did he change his stance. He wasn't a leader on this issue. He was actually vehemently opposed to equal rights, and it wasn't until it was, as I said, politically expedient that he actually changed his position on this. All right, moving on. The senator from MBNA. So Ralph Nader once quipped that General Motors could buy Delaware if DuPont were willing to sell it. And I'm not going to go too much into Delaware's history, but it has a very peculiar history for being very cozy to corporate interests. And this is where Joe Biden was a senator from. In 1994, he voted to repeal the Rigel-Neal Interstate Banking Act. And in 1996, he voted for the Financial Services Modernization Act, which repealed Glass-Steagall. And this allowed banks to own securities and insurance companies. So again, if we're looking at the current banking system we have now, and say the financial collapse of 2008, we can look to these two acts, which deregulated the banking system to such a point where they became too big to fail and then failed. And these were both things that Joe Biden, as the senator from MBNA, was fully in support of, voted for, fought for. The 2005 Bankruptcy Abuse Prevention and Consumer Act. So again, this was something that at the time, George Bush Jr. was president, and I associated this act with Republicans. But again, going back in hindsight and studying history, it turns out that it was Joe Biden who was the author of much of this legislation and the principal person in the Senate who got this legislation passed. Here's a quote from Elizabeth Warren back in 2005. His energetic work on behalf of the credit card companies has earned him the affection of the banking industry and protected him from any well-funded challengers for his Senate seat. So what this act did is it made it almost impossible for regular citizens like you and me to file bankruptcy. Before we can file bankruptcy, we would have to go through a process of validating that we absolutely couldn't pay our bills. We'd have to speak to a financial advisor, and really try to push us into it, rather than just dissolving our debts, working out a debt payment plan to the credit card industries. It also made it impossible to discharge student loans through bankruptcy. So when we look at the current student loan debt crisis, once again, we can thank Joe Biden for it. There's very few things in the last 30 to 40 years of bad policy that doesn't have Joe Biden's name somewhere on it. Continuing on, the wrong side of history. In 1976 and again in 1993, he voted for the Hyde Amendments, which made it illegal to use federal fundings for abortion. And also he was a champion of the Iraq War. He stated that, "I believe it is a march to peace and security. I believe that failure to overwhelmingly support this resolution is likely to enhance the prospects that war will occur." And this is just brilliant doublespeak. He's saying that failure to vote for war will make it more likely that war will occur. It's just mind-boggling. But this was Joe Biden. He wanted an invasion of Iraq. He voted for it. He fought for it. And when I say he championed for it, as with his position in the Senate, at this time now he's the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, he could have called witnesses that disproved the narrative we were getting from the Bush-Cheney administration. Instead, almost all the witnesses he called parroted what the administration was saying. He didn't challenge the administration. He didn't look for counter evidence. He pushed to support the invasion without any credible challenge from what should have been his opposition party. All right, moving on. All right, so sexual harassment allegations. So we've all heard the nickname Creepy Joe. We've all seen the videos of him sniffing somebody's hair or touching their shoulder or kissing them. And a lot of people, particularly Democrats, particularly supporters of Joe Biden, really try to downplay these actions. And I just want you to, anybody listening to this, just put yourself in, imagine yourself standing there. You're getting ready to go out in front of a crowd. This is for work. You're gonna go do a big presentation. You're gonna go lead a meeting in front of all your coworkers. And right before you go on stage, your boss comes up behind you, puts his hands on your shoulders, leans in and deeply sniffs your hair. There is no universe where this is even remotely acceptable. But this is the kind of behavior that Joe Biden has been engaged in for his entire career, and everybody just has kind of accepted that's just Joe being Joe. Well, that's not Joe being Joe. That's a really powerful man using his power for his own weird sense of gratification at the expense of other people's safety and well-being. And there's no tolerance for this. There should be no tolerance for this. There should be no excuse for this. And again, he has not ever actually apologized for it. Now we have Tara Reade. So Tara Reade has for years, she was an assistant to Joe Biden while he was a senator in the early 90s. She has maintained for the better part of 3 decades that he sexually harassed her before firing her when she tried to report it. At the beginning of 2020, actually at the end of 2019, she was trying to get somebody to get the media to report her story that it was actually more than just harassment, that he actually did sexually assault her. Nobody would carry this story. No mainstream media would carry this story, would run with it until well into the primary, after Joe Biden had all but secured the nomination. Then they started releasing the story. It was, I think, The Hill was the first outlet to really report this story, and this was in January of 2020. But by then it was really too late. And then the MSNBC, CNN, they didn't talk about it until well after the primary was all but won, and they ran the story for basically a news cycle or two before they dropped it. So this is somebody. The Democrat Party is supposed to be the party of Me Too. It's supposed to be the power of female empowerment, the party of female empowerment, the acknowledgement of the sexual harassment and rape culture. But when it came time to supporting women and their allegations, or supporting the powerful, the presumptive head of their party, they backed the head of their party and silenced this woman making an accusation. That's the legacy of the 2020 campaign, as far as I'm concerned. And that's it. This is the person that's going to be the 46th president of the United States. He was a segregationist. He was the principal author of The War on Drugs, which has devastated this country, caused mass incarceration, primarily of black men, militarized our police forces. He made it impossible for working class people to file bankruptcy, created the student loan debt crisis that we have right now, failed to act on behalf of women when he had the opportunity to do so, and today he will be sworn in as president. I hope the best for him, because we're stuck with him. So much like people would say 4 years ago, give Trump a chance, which I did not subscribe to, and I'll talk about that tomorrow. Hopefully there is some mechanism soon where he will be held accountable for what he's done. But for now, we are stuck with this guy as president, who has been wrong on almost every issue for the last 40 years. So that's Joe Biden. We're going to see him sworn in here in just a few hours, and As you all know, this is a very tense time for the United States. Hopefully, the actions of January 6th aren't repeated today, although I think that's wishful thinking. Probably as I'm recording this right now, there's things already happening. But hopefully we make it through today, and the events of January 6th lead to some sort of an awakening of the injustices that exist in this country. And I'll be talking more about that tomorrow, and then again on Friday, and it's probably going to be a recurring theme throughout my time doing this broadcast. These injustices. And on that note, there's one segment. There is one segment that I'm going to cut to today, and that is just do it right here. So, sorry, I'm manipulating everything myself here. So one of the things I want to do is talk about some specific cases from the Innocence Project. And the Innocence Project is an organization that goes out and actually tries to overturn people that they believe was wrongfully convicted. So every day I'm going to come up here and, knowing I'm an old G.I. Joe fan, knowing it's half the battle, understanding these cases, understanding what went wrong, hopefully will help us understand, particularly if we ever have to serve on a jury, will help us understand what to do right in the future. So this first case I want to talk about today, let's see if I can get over here. Excuse me. This is Kenneth Adams. So Kenneth Adams was released after serving 18 years in jail. And all of this comes to us from the innocenceproject.org website. He was convicted in 1978, released in 1996. He is African American, and he was convicted along with 3 other men, known as the Fort Heights Four, sentenced to 75 years in prison, and eventually his case was overturned after he got access to a DNA test, and him and his other compatriots were exonerated and released. So among the things that went wrong, so serology, there was some flawed analysis of fluids at the scene. The hair analysis done at the scene was completely flawed, and there was eyewitness misidentification. There was the false testimony of jailhouse informants, and looking at other sources and reviewing this case, the informants actually were offered, one of the informants, the jailhouse informants that was testified against Mr. Adams, was offered a reduced sentence on his own robbery case, which prompted him to do this. The police at the time had evidence of the people that ultimately did the case. They ignored that and instead convicted these 4 individuals, including Kenneth Adams. So a couple was kidnapped in 1978, murdered, the woman gang raped, and the police, although they had leads on the people that actually committed this crime, ignored those leads, convicted these four individuals, and they served 18 years in prison unjustly. And that's the real tragedy. When we talk about, a lot of people get, when it comes to crime, murders, rapes, kidnappings, assaults, robberies, people get really emotional about it because they want to see justice done. So when they see that somebody's been convicted, when they see that somebody's been arrested, when somebody's been convicted, cognitive dissonance kicks in, and people want to believe that that person is the one who did it. But we have an obligation not just to protect the innocent, but to seek justice for the victims, to really ensure that the people that we're arresting and trying and convicting are the actual right people. It's not just that 4 people, in this case 4 men, spent 18 years in jail, which is horrific, but the victims, murdered, raped victims, had their assailants go free for 18 years. So justice is never served by convicting the wrong person. And in this case, and you're going to see this over and over again as I go through these cases, the evidence for a right conviction to actually arrest the correct person is almost always there and almost always ignored. So we have an obligation. We have an obligation as a people to do better on this front. So that was Kenneth Adams, convicted in 1978, freed in 1996, and more power to him, and more power to the Innocence Project. So that's going to pretty much wrap up this broadcast. Before I, some of the things that's going to be talked about on the show is pretty serious. So at least for now, I kind of want to end the show on somewhat of a humorous note. So this is something that's going to be called The Last Word, and it's going to be some kind of a shared TikTok video. Hopefully, I'd like to use this space to highlight some people that have a different perspective than I do. But for now, it's just going to be kind of a fun little thing. So before we go to the credits, here are some little kittens to enjoy. Peace.